All right, today we will go to Ireland. As I promised you, I was able to do some filming over there with Marcia. So we'll read some of the poetry in the exact places where it was written, which has become my passion, this idea of traveling to the actual places where people did their writing. There's a history of this going back as long as we know, but an interesting example, and I think that everybody should have a story like this, so we need very wealthy friends. An example of this was, there was, in the 18th century, there was a philologist who was interested in finding out more about Homer and about his work, and decided to travel to all of the places that are mentioned in Homer's works, and to see, first of all, what the relationship is between the actual space and the text, and also to ask some burning questions such as, was Homer in fact literate? Because this is an oral tradition, as you know, that was passed down. It wasn't entirely clear that Homer had actually written anything. That in fact it was memorized along the way. So he had a very wealthy banker friend. This is where the wealth comes in. He had a very wealthy banker friend who bought him a boat and filled it with every known book about Homer. And he spent the next few years traveling to all of the places where Homer, that Homer makes reference to, all the way through Greece and what is now Italy. And I think that the quality of the discoveries when you're actually in those places is quite different. And so we all, if you have a banker friend, you know, those people who steal from us, those people there. It would, anyway, it's a great, and we do this, as I've mentioned to you, we do this, I'm actually leaving right after this class next week to go to Switzerland, and there we go to the places where Byron and Shelley and Mary Shelley and others were when they were writing their works, and we stand in those places where they wrote. So on your vacation time, this is a great way to travel. You take some of your favorite works, you find out where they were written or the areas that they describe, and you go to those places. It really is unimaginably fun. So I encourage that. I also spent yesterday, I'm in the final process of reading the proofs for my novel that's coming out. It's called Hatched. So I was hoping, secretly hoping, that I would be able to release it in the course of this class and hand out copies to all of you, but it will be out actually, I think, in the summer. But I will keep you informed about it. It's very fun. It's an enormous task to write poetry, and it seems like a very enormous task to write novel. This is one that I dreamed on my honeymoon with Marcia 8 years ago. And I woke up and said to her, you would not believe what I just dreamed. And then I forgot all of it because there were other things to do. And then I remembered all of it and told her. And I spent 8 years writing it. So it's just about to be published. And the other funny thing I think about novel writing, this is I've written lots of nonfiction, but not fiction. And they assigned an editor who then started asking questions. And you kind of have this feeling, I think, with Yeats, that nothing has to be corrected. It comes out perfect, and then you just leave it. But in fact, to have an editor say, are you sure that you got this character straight over here? Or is that the right accent for the, like these questions? And you're like, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought of that. That's really a good question. I'm glad that you were there, even though I feel weird about an editor correcting fiction. It's an odd relationship that you have. So in any event, I will send you news about this thing. It's a terribly bawdy story in both the B-A-W and the B-O-D sense of bawdy. So it's not for the prudish at heart. And again, nothing about me is for the prudish of heart, so that's okay. So I want to remind us what it sounds like to hear Yeats first. He's not going to move, unfortunately. This was the BBC recording. And then we'll go to the tower itself, and we'll go to the Lake Isle of Innisfree. And in the Lake Isle of Innisfree, we'll read a little bit of a preface that he had written about the experience and then the poetry itself. So that we can begin with him. I will mute this.
Rise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, clay and metals made. 19 rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning, to where the cricket sings, their midnights all a glimmer, and I will rise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sound for the shore, when I scan the roadway around the pavement's grey, I hear it in the deep heart's core.
It's so beautiful. It's just shocking. And now I will bring you to the Lake Isle itself, I hope. Here. Okay, so I'm standing, we tried to guess where he was standing when he wrote this, or at least to try to imagine the exact area that he's describing. So I'm standing here on a little dock that he describes in some of the notes for it. So I think that this should be accurate. And it's also at roughly the hour at which he was going to go to the Lake Isle of Innisfree was late in the afternoon. So Marcia and I went there at roughly that time, and this is what it sounds like and looks like. So there's a brief preface of his words about the experience first.
When I said to my uncle, echoing some book I had read, that I never knew a countryside till one knew it at night, he was pleased, and he approved. When I told him I was going to walk round Lough Gill and sleep in a wood, I did not tell him all of my object, for I was nursing a new ambition. My father had read to me some and I had planned to live someday in a cottage on a little island called Innisfree. And Innisfree was opposite Slish Wood, where I meant to sleep. I set out from Sligo about 6 in the evening, walking slowly, for it was an evening of great beauty. But though I was well into Slish Wood by bedtime, I could not sleep, not from the discomfort of the dry rock I had chosen for my bed, but from the fear of the wood ranger. Someone had told me, though I do not think it could have been true, that he went his round at some unknown hour. I kept going over what I should say if I found, and could not think of anything he would believe. However, I could watch my island in the early dawn and notice the order of the cries of the birds. I will rise and go now, and go to Innisfree, in a small cabin built there, of clay and rattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live among the bee loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the veils of the morning to where the cricket sings. There's midnight all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavements gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. The fiddles of Dooney. When I play on my fiddle in Dooney, folk dance like a wave of the sea. My cousin is priest in Kilvarny. I read in my books of songs I bought at the Sligo Fair. When we come at the end of time to Peter sitting in state, he will smile in the three old spirits, but call me first through the gate. For the good are always the merry, save by an evil chance, and the merry love the fiddle, and the merry love to dance. And when the folk there spy me, they will all come up to me. Here is the fiddler of Dooney, and dance like the wave of a sea.
Okay, so that's the setting within which it's all conceived of. The first one, of course, being the Lake Island, the second one being more representative of what's out there in the hills. So it's a fun, the fiddler, it's a fun, let me give you the page number and the reference.
There's midnight. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavements gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. The fiddles of Dooney.
So if you have your book, yeah, it's not in his collected works. I don't think. Yeah, it's part of this broader introduction that he has at the outset that describes the context. So let me send you that reference next time. So it's a practice that has kind of grown on us, and we now do it at the foot of Mont Blanc, and we do it at the Villa Diodetti in Geneva, where Frankenstein was conceived of, and everywhere else we can imagine. We just travel in this way. I also have the tower. We did a whole lot of them. I'm not so sure the sound is right on the tower, so I'm going to show it to you, and we can read along. If there's no sound, I'll just read alongside of it, and at least you can see what this looks like. Again, just sort of panning around. You enter onto his property, and it's, as you'll see, it's more or less exactly as he describes it. So let's just take a look at a couple of moments. Yeah, it's soundless. So this is the tower. What shall I do with this absurdity, O heart, O troubled heart, this caricature, decrepit age that has been tied to me as to a dog's tail? Never had I more excited, passionate, fantastical imagination, nor an ear and eye that more expected the impossible. No, not in boyhood, when with rod and fly, or the humbler worm, I climbed Ben Bulbin's back and had the livelong summer day to spend. It seems that I must bid the muse go pack, choose Plato and Plotinus for a friend, until imagination, ear, and eye can be content with argument and deal in abstract things, or be derided by a sort of battered kettle at the heel. I pace the battlements and stare on the foundations of a house. There. Or where tree, like sooty finger, starts from the earth, and send imagination forth under the day's declining beam, and call images and memories from ruin or from ancient trees, for I would ask a question of them all. Beyond that ridge lived Mrs. French, and once when every silver candlestick or sconce lit up the dark mahogany in the wine, a serving man that could divine that most respected lady's every wish ran, and with the garden shears clipped an insolent farmer's ears and brought them in a little covered dish. Some few remembered still when I was young a peasant girl commended by a song, who would live somewhere upon that rocky place, and praised the color of her face, and had the greater joy in praising her, remembering that if walked she there, farmers jostled at the fair, so great a glory did the song confer. And certain men, being maddened by those rhymes, or else by toasting her a score of times, rose from the table and declared it right to test their fancy by their sight. But they mistook the brightness of the moon for the prosaic light of day. Music had driven their wits astray, and one was drowned in the great bog of Clun. Strange, but the man who made the song was blind. Yet now I have considered it, I find that nothing strange. The tragedy began with Homer. That was a blind man. And Helen has all living hearts betrayed. Oh, may the moon and sunlight seem one inextricable beam, for I triumph. For if I triumph, I must make men mad. And I myself created Hanrahan and drove him drunk or sober through the dawn from somewhere in the neighboring cottages. Caught by an old man's juggleries, he stumbled, tumbled, fumbled to and fro, and had but broken knees for hire and horrible splendor of desire. I thought it all out 20 years ago. Goodfellow shuffled cards in an old bawn, and when the ancient ruffian's turn was on, he so bewitched the cards under his thumb that all but the one card became a pack of hounds and not a pack of cards, and that he changed into a hare. Hanrahan rose in frenzy there and followed up those baying creatures towards I've forgotten what. Enough! I must recall a man that neither love nor music nor an enemy's clipped ear could, he was so harried, cheer. A figure that has grown so fabulous there's not neighbor left to say when he finished his dog's day, an ancient bankrupt master of this house. Before that ruin came, for centuries, rough men at arms, cross-gartered to the knees or shod in iron, climbed the narrow stairs, and certain men at arms there were whose images in the great memory stored come with loud cry and panting breast to break upon a sleeper's rest while the great wooden dice beat on the board. As I would question all who can. Come old, necessitous, half-mounted man, and bring beauty's blind, rambling celebrant, the red man, the juggler's seat, through God-forsaken's meadow, Mrs. French, gifted with so fine an ear, the man drowned in a bog's mire, when mocking muses chose the country's wench. Did all old men and women, rich and poor, who trode upon these rocks or passed this door, whether in public or in secret, rage, as I do now, against old age? But I have found an answer in those eyes that are impatient to be gone. Go, therefore, but leave Hanrahan, for I need all his mighty memories. Old lecher with a love on every wind, bring up out of that deep considering mind all that you have discovered in the grave. For it is certain that you have reckoned upon up every unforeknown, unseeing plunge, lured by softening eye or by a touch or a sigh into the labyrinth of another's being. Does the imagination dwell the most upon a woman won or a woman lost? If on the lost, admit you turned aside from a great labyrinth out of pride, cowardice, some silly over-subtle thought, or anything called conscience once, and that if memory recur, the sun's under eclipse and the day's blotted out. It is time that I wrote my will. I choose upstanding men that climb the streams until the fountain leap, and at dawn drop their cast at their side of dripping stone. I declare they shall inherit my pride, the pride of people that were bound neither to cause nor to state, neither to slaves that were spat on, nor to the tyrants that spat, the people of Burke and Grattan, that gave, though free to refuse, pride, like that of the morn, when the headlong light is loose, or that of the fabulous horn, or that of the sudden shower when all streams are dry, or that of the hour when the swan must fix his eye upon a fading gleam, float out upon a long last reach a glittering stream, and there sing his last song. And I declare my faith. I mock Plotinus' thought and cry in Plato's teeth, death and life were not till man made up the whole, made lock, stock, and barrel out of his bitter soul. I, sun and moon and star all, and further add to that being dead we rise, dream, and so create translunar paradise. I have prepared my peace with learned Italian things and the proud stones of Greece, poets' imaginings and memories of love, memories of the words of women, all those things whereof man makes a superhuman mirror resembling a dream. As at the loophole there, the daws chatter and scream and drop twigs layer upon layer. When they have mounted up, the mother bird will rest upon their hollow top and so warm her wild nest. I leave both faith and pride to young upstanding men climbing the mountainside, that under the bursting dawn they may drop a fly, being of that metal made, till it was broken by this sedentary trade. Now shall I make my soul, compelling it to study in a learned school, till the wreck of body, slow decay of blood, testy delirium, or dull decrepitude, or what worse evil come, the death of friends, or death of every brilliant eye that made a catch in the breath, seem but the clouds of the sky when the horizon fades, or a bird's sleepy cry among the deepening shades. That was kind of fun. To travel there with you, and we walked around while we read it. That's a good idea. There's one more that I have. So as you can see, and we should all do this when we buy a house, you have to find out the local lore, the stories that are told. We just bought a farm. Some of the stories are a little more dubious than others. Find out the stories, and then make up stories and combine them. There's something beautiful about that, I think. And then link them to the great stories like Homer, at which he mentions, or Plotinus. So he creates this whole world, partly fabricated by his own characters, partly fabricated by others, and then partly the lore of the region. So you do this in your own house, on your property, and you find out who was there and who you're linking to and who you want to be linked to, because he was very selective, of course, in his linking. And he was particularly fond of the fact that the place was decrepit, falling down, and the house that you see beside the tower he restored for his wife, George, and the tower remained roofless during his lifetime. So you've got the project also, the poetic project of inscribing this into the stone, and then the architectural project of renovating the place so that you can live in it. Here's another one called My Descendants. And in case the sound doesn't work in here, I had just bought this thing, and I didn't know how to use it, so I'm just carrying it around. So just in case, it's on 201 of my version in here. Let me see. All right. Having inherited a vigorous mind from my old fathers, I must nourish dreams and leave a woman and a man behind. As vigorous of mind, and yet it seems life scarce can cast a fragrance on the wind, scarce spread a glory to the morning beams, but the torn petals strew the garden plot, and there is but common greenness after that. And what if my descendants lose the flower through natural declension of the soul, through too much business with the passing hour, through too much play, or marriage with a fool? May this laborious stair and this dark tower become a roofless ruin, that the owl may build in the cracked masonry and cry her desolation to the desolate sky. The primum mobile that fashioned us has made the very owls in circles move, and I, that count myself most prosperous, seeing that love and friendship are enough, for an old neighbor's friendship, chose the house and decked and altered it for a girl's love, and know whatever flourish and decline, these stones remain their monument and mine. So you're just going to walk around your property and do that. And he does it with everything. He does it with the streams, and he does it with the tower, and he does it with the house, and then he invokes honeybees so that they'll come and build a nest in the stair. He invokes, as you can see, the owls in case his descendants betray his name and so forth. So there's a lot of work to be done, and for him, this is, as we've sort of insisted all along, a kind of labor that you do, partly in the face of old age, and partly in the face of the chaos that surrounds the tower and the modern world. So this constant linking up, the personal experience, the place of the personal experience, the place from which he comes, linked up more broadly to all of Ireland, and then to the history of the literary world that has informed his writings. So it's a constant conversation that he's having with the present and the past that I find really quite amazing and intriguing. To get to know Yeats means to get to know this land, I think. So that's why I wanted to bring you some of these images that I hadn't dug out for a while. It's really fun, I think, to do this. So we can now go back to the texts themselves and take a look at, not that one, that's my novel. Watch out what you ask for. And we go to one of his most famous poems. And now, and again, I keep thinking like this in this, doing this together with you, that setting the stage the way we've set it, when we come to a very, very well-known work that you all know, many of you probably know this by heart, and you undoubtedly studied it in school, when you come back to it after thinking about the tower the way we have, and after thinking about Yeats with the themes that we've developed, it reads differently, and the accents are a little bit different. So he is 60 by now, so you know that he's born in 1865. So this is 1925. He's 14 years from the end of his life. And he's become a very public man. And as we've said, he becomes a senator in Ireland. So this is an image of him as an older man, although we see him old kind of since the beginning, I think. An image of him as an older man and a public figure. So let's see how it feels now to go back to this monument in his work and think about it in regards to what we've been talking about. I walk through the long schoolroom questioning. A kind old nun in a white hood replies. The children learn to cipher and to sing, to study reading books and history, to cut and sew, be neat in everything in the best modern way. The children's eyes, in momentary wonder, stare upon a 60-year-old smiling public man. I dream of a Lydian body bent above a sinking fire, a tale that she told of a harsh reproof or trivial event that changed some childish day to tragedy. Told, and it seemed that our two natures blent into a sphere from youthful sympathy, or else to alter Plato's parable into the yolk and white of the one shell. And thinking of that fit of grief or rage, I look upon a child or t'other there and wonder if she stood so at that age. For even daughters of the swan can share something of every paddler's heritage, and have that color upon cheek or hair, and thereupon my heart is driven wild. She stands before me as a living child. Her present image floats into the mind. Did Quattrocento finger fashion it hollow of cheek, as though it drank the wind and took a mess of shadows for its meat? And I, though never of Lydian kind, had pretty plumage once. Enough of that. Better to smile on all that smile, and show there is a comfortable kind of old scarecrow. What youthful mother! A shape upon her lap, honey of generation had betrayed, and that must sleep, shriek, struggle to escape, as recollection or the drug decide, would think her son, did she but see that shape with 60 or more winters on its head, a compensation for the pang of its birth, or the uncertainty of his setting forth. Plato thought nature but a spume that plays upon a ghostly paradigm of things. Solider Aristotle played the tawse upon the bottom of a king of kings. World-famous golden-thighed Pythagoras fingered upon a middle stick or strings where the stars sang and careless muses heard old clothes upon old sticks to scare a bird. Both nuns and mothers worship images. But those the candles light are not those that animate the mother's reveries, but keep a marble or a bronze repose, and yet they too break hearts. O presences that passion, piety, or affection knows, and that all heavenly glory symbolize, O self-born mockers of man's enterprise. Labor is blossoming or dancing, where the body is not bruised to pleasure's soul, nor beauty born out of its own despair, nor blear-eyed wisdom out of midnight oil. O chestnut tree, great rooted blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl? O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? So we come to this so much later, but you've seen Leda, you've heard of Aristotle talked about from his perspective, you've heard Plato described from his perspective, you know him as an old man, obsessed by these images and obsessed by the modern world and so forth. And now when we read this, I think it just feels like so much of the course begins to come together in this one work, including, of course, the work of the poetry itself and his reflection upon the dubious activities of youth, even as we both, I mean, it's an interesting take on romanticism. The Romantics celebrated the youthful gaze. You look at children and you think, oh, if only I could see the world as the child sees the world, with that kind of youthful innocence. But it's also youthful stupidity, right? Youthful nonsense, youthful waste. And we saw this in the Song of the Old Mother, right, as she's sitting in front of the fire, trying to keep the place heated, even as they're thinking trite and trivial thoughts. And here we see it in the school, as he, as a public man, and presumably thinking about the task of education, sees them with their kind of trite activities and so forth. And so lines, I think, that jump out at us in light of what we've talked about include, for example, the children learn to cipher and to sing, which of course has been one of his goals, to study reading books and history, to cut and sew. All of that sounds like poetry. Be neat in everything in the best modern way doesn't sound like poetry. That sounds trite and trivial, right? But so you've got this. You don't really know how you feel after this poem. I think you have a real strong sense of ambivalence about the wisdom of age, and that age is wasted because the youth does not recognize it. They stare in wonder. The children stare in momentary wonder. They don't admire. They don't recognize what's in front of them. You just stare in momentary wonder. Oh, there's an old man, and then they get back to what is more important in life. So it's fascinating, and of course, the reflection. I love that he imagines himself young, imagines Leda young, and then that unimaginable question that he poses, that I think has got to be one of the hardest questions in the English language poetry that I can think of, about the mother, the youthful mother, and the question of compensation, right? What youthful mother a shape upon her lap, honey of generation had betrayed, and that my sleep, shriek, struggle to escape, as recollection or the drug decide, would think her son, that she would see that shape with 60 or more winters on its head, a compensation for the pang of his birth or the uncertainty of his setting forth. That's a shocking stanza, I think. Who could imagine when you look at your kid old that it was worth it? You hope that you've got an answer for this one. That's a tough one. So I've sort of emphasized and mentioned this a few times, but and this is something that's not talked about really in the literature. I think Yeats is hilarious. Somebody mentioned in a previous class that it's quite a bleak vision, and it is, I think, in many ways a bleak vision. But he's funny. He's ludic. He imagines himself a woman. He imagines himself a swan. He imagines himself being raped by a swan. He imagines a child young. He imagines a child old. He's got this multiplicity of scenarios in his head, including his own characters walking around and criticizing him, which is really, I think, remarkable and quite unprecedented, it would seem to me, in the literary tradition. So the other thing, of course, is that there's all these, it's sort of flecked with images from the past, many of which are quite arcane, but he really describes it as though he's kind of just putting stuff together that sounds good and creates an image. All right, the next one that I want to look at with you is the Winding Stair. So we've seen in our discussions of poetry, one of the questions that we've had to ask is, what is it for? What are we trying to do with poetry? Poetry has a small array of very heavy tasks. I think if we want to name the principal task of poetry, it's to provide compensation. It is not the case that you can, with your words, create truth, unless you're a delirious politician or a god. But the idea that you can speak and make something manifest is, in a sense, the goal of poetry. And if you can't do that, then at least you get some kind of compensation in not being able to do it. So that being the case, poetry is uttered when? When your lover is far away, and you lie in bed, and you call out his name with the false hope, or maybe real hope, that the name will invoke the person. I have a theory about going to restaurants. We waste a lot of money in restaurants. The food tends to be quite terrible, prepared by people who don't know what they're doing, in dubious circumstances, served by people who don't drink, who are making recommendations as to what kind of wine you should have. It's an embarrassing experience in almost every possible way. I'm always mortified sitting in restaurants in places where it's not the studied art that it should be. But we do it, and we do it, for example, for our children. So you go out and you spend a month's heating bill on one crappy meal, and you ask yourself subsequently, when you're not feeling well and you think the chef didn't wash his hands, why did you do this? And there was all this hype about the place, and you stood in line and so forth, and it was just terrible. It was terrible. I mean, it was a fun time with the children. Luckily, you drank 3 bottles of wine, so you can forget about it, but it's not. So what is the advantage doing this, and why do people do it when they make a lot of money? I think it is for a poetic reason, which is that for once in your life, you say, I'd like another glass of water, and it comes. So it's that dream that we have of, the open sesame thing, where you open sesame and the sesame opens. You order something and it comes, and it's too cold, so it gets hotter, or whatever it is. So you have this strange power, and you sit there, and here they obsessively come to you like 1,000 times, so you're really getting your money's worth. Every time you take a sip, there's like another half gallon that's poured. There's some kind of power that you're invoking over the people, and then they, which is interesting, having worked a lot in restaurants, and in fact my novel's about restaurants, so I'm obsessed, and eggs, so I'm doubly obsessed. I don't know if you've worked in restaurants, but what do you do after a shift in which you've killed yourself working for other people and you've made paltry sums working in a restaurant? You go to a restaurant and you get smashed. And you think, well, why did I do it? It was a complete waste of time. I could have just stayed home and, I would have saved money by not working. But I think it has something to do with this power of creating that which you describe. You read this in the Bible, right? You say something and it happens. It's what we presumably want. So there is that side, which I think to be an interesting linguistic question, the relationship between language and thought, that poetry asks and answers in some ways. And then there's invocations like, may it be the case that, whatever, right? So you're sending your words out in the hope that they will do something, that they will have some kind of power. Or, most commonly, I think, they are there to offer compensation. So in the loss, the most appropriate thing to read at a funeral is poetry. Why is that? Why that tradition? Because it seems to me that you're building an edifice not unlike a tombstone, which is powerful and which will remain beyond the passing. And you will offer some kind of compensation, obviously inadequate compensation, but compensation nonetheless for death. So these are the kinds of things that Yeats forces us to think about, because all of his poems are about solving some kind of problem, and almost every problem has something to do with compensation. And this is a fun one, I think, because it sets out various versions of this. This is from the next book of poetry by Yeats, following the Tower, which is called The Winding Stair and Other Poems. And again, now that we've spent time in the Tower and talked about some of the themes, it resonates, I think, very powerfully. Blessed be this place, more blessed still this tower. A bloody, arrogant power rose out of the race, uttering, mastering it, rose like these walls from these storm-beaten cottages. In mockery I have set a powerful emblem up, and sing it in rhyme upon rhyme, in mockery of a time half dead at the top. Alexandria's was a beacon tower, and Babylon's an image of the moving heavens, a log book of the sun's journey and the moon's. And Shelley had his towers, thought's crowned powers, he called them once. And here we go. This is like, it took us all this time to get here, but here we are. I declare this tower is my symbol. I declare this winding, gyring, spiring treadmill of a stair is my ancestral stair. The goldsmith and the dean, Berkeley, and Burke have traveled there. Swift beating on his breast in Sibylline frenzy blind, because the heart in his blood-sodden breast had dragged him down into mankind, Goldsmith deliberately sipping at the honey pot of his own mind. And hot-ear-headed Burke that proved the state a tree, that this unconquerable labyrinth of the birds, century after century, cast but dead leaves to mathematical equality. And God appointed Berkeley that proved all things a dream, that this pragmatical, preposterous pig of a world, as far that so solid seem, must vanish on the instant, if the mind but change its theme. Saevo, Ignatio, and the laborer's hire, the strength that gives our blood and state magnanimity of its own desire, everything that is not God, consumed with intellectual fire. The purity of the unclouded moon has flung its arrowy shaft upon the floor. 7 centuries have passed, and it is pure. The blood of innocence has left no stain. There, on blood-saturated ground, have stood soldier, assassin, executioner. Whether for daily pittance, or in blind fear, or out of abstract hatred, and shed blood, but could not cast a single jet thereon. Odor of blood on the ancestral stair, and we that have shed none must gather there, and clamor in drunken frenzy for the moon. Upon the dusty, glittering windows cling, and seem to cling upon the moonlit skies, tortoise-shell butterflies, peacock butterflies, a couple of night moths are on the wing. Is every modern nation, like the Tower, half dead at the top? No matter what I said, for wisdom is the property of the dead, a something incompatible with life, and power, like everything that has the stain of blood, a property of the living. But no stain can come upon the visage of the moon when it has looked in glory from a cloud. These questions are so mean. And this declaration, if it had not been, and again, this comes late, this declaration of the symbol of the tower as being at the heart and center. But again, this constant moving, his tower happens to be roofless, what he calls half dead at the top. And then he imagines the 7 centuries of age that this tower has endured, and the people who lived there and what they stood for, and then poses that reflection. Is my tower the same as every other civilization that's ever come? And again, linking himself along the way to the philosophers who are hereby mentioned. So the other goal that he's establishing for himself here is to try to link himself to a glorious past. And here too, we've talked about children in this class because of poems like My Descendants, poems like A Prayer for My Son, poems like A Prayer for My Daughter. One of your objectives in poetry also is to link yourself to a tradition to which you want to have some affiliation, and to deride the affiliation that you don't want. Right? And that's very much present here. So you see in this, so again, we keep asking what the work is of the poet. You can see why this is such work. You have this labor that you need to accomplish. When you think of the symbols that he chooses for his labor, his own symbol is the tower, right? And I've put it at the center of this course. But he also makes reference to other symbols that surround the tower. One of them, and one of my favorites, is the bees. And there is, in the book called The Tower, he has the line, "Oh, come honey bees and make a nest of the stair." So why bees? The bee, and it's such a perfect image of himself. The bee goes from place to place and finds momentary instances of beauty in the form of flowers, and touches them, and in fact does enormous work. Without the bees, the flowers would not survive. Gathers it up, goes back to the hive, and after billions of instances of this, creates a world, and as it turns out, sweetness. The honey itself being a kind of the product of this. So you create, through labor, this amazing edifice that is both eternal, but also transient in the way that sweetness is. And so that is, I think, is such a beautiful image of the work of the poet, the role of the poet. And he does so inside of a tower. Why the tower? The same reason as why the tree. Because the tower is, to use his words, deeply rooted. The deeply rooted tower, that which cannot be upset, and that which will outlive us. Other references that he makes in his work all the way through, and we've mentioned a bunch of them, are roses. And roses are, again, it's got all of these qualities that we're talking about. The temporal, it's there for a moment. It's gorgeous. It's perfect. And it's also, in Kant's sense, beautiful. And why beautiful? Because it's perfectly symmetrical, right? It is a monument to its own perfection, but contradictory and complex as well, with its thorns and on the one hand feels like it's going to last forever, which is of course the obsession in poetry, but also totally transient. It will the next day perhaps begin to lose its petals. So each of these symbols that he makes reference to, in a sense, set up the labor that we've been describing. And it's just these moments. I declare this tower my symbol. I declare this winding, gyring, spiring treadmill of a stair. Now, gyre, you keep hearing about, right? Turning, the widening gyre, right? The falconer loses sight of the falcon. So the gyre, and you know this from the book called The Vision, is this these complex movements of the heavens that create meaning in the universe, right? So we're surrounded by these gyres, and his wife's automatic writing presumably connected into these gyres to try to understand how in the world the universe works. That's from that hilarious poem that we read about his three characters, Robartus and Hanrahan and himself. So they're out there. But he also imagines that the stair, which if you visit Yeats's Thoor Ballylee, you can go and see, is itself a winding stair. And we talked about that in regards to him having to go to sleep, and before going to sleep, before mounting the winding stairs to bed, he says, he has to bury all of his friends again, remember all of the people who have died. But he uses that in describing the stair, he describes it as winding, as we've seen, gyring. So the stair itself somehow makes reference to the eternal, the eternality and the profundity of whatever it is he's trying to understand about the heavens. Treadmill, which is cyclical and going nowhere in a sense, of a stair, is my ancestral stair. So he's bought the place, and he's doing what we're trying to do in Cane Ridge, which is to pretend we've always lived there, right? That somehow this earth, we adopted as our own. And if you think like this, which frankly I don't need to tell you I'm a bit of a fan of, so I'm building this pavilion. Maybe next year we do a book launch at this pavilion I'm building. I'm building this pavilion in the backyard, which was supposed to be for tractors, and I'm putting in a floor. So I'm making this floor, which is itself an interesting poetic act, right? You've got nature, and upon it you put wood from the trees around it. And as I do it, there are these two gigantic bees that keep me company, and they're always there. And they come around and they hover and they sit there for a second, and then they come back and then they go. And I think I can either read Yeats or I can go out on the property and I can build a floor. It's the same thing. And we're both doing the same thing. We're both trying to create meaning. And I talk to the bees and I feel protected by them. I'm trying to create this whole world that makes some kind of sense to me, respectful of the bees that already live there, and telling them, this is a floor, you can use it if you like. I'll put a pizza oven in case you like pizza, and we'll share this place. And trying to put, and again, a floor made of the trees that surround the place, there's something deeply symbolic about that, and that's fun. It's symbolism is fun. It's a lot, a lot more fun than a lot of other things I can think of doing. But to do so, he has to also link himself to a past. He has to find a glorious past that he accepts. So I don't know what the glorious past on this farm is. I probably would abhor it, so I'll try and stay away from knowing too much. So I probably want to link my task to nature. He tries to link his past to a glorious past, so that he a Protestant, ties himself to a great ancestral home with great ancestral acts and so forth and so on, that tie him to a past that he finds acceptable. And then he gives his descriptions of the people that he's admiring. Now, the next place that I'm going to bring you to, and I thought I had videos, but we must have run out of something, so I couldn't find them last night. And this is called Cool Park. And he knew this very wealthy woman, and he used to go and stay with her in this incredibly beautiful place called Cool Park. And he actually makes reference in this next poem to both Cool Park and Ballylee. So again, on your trip that you're going to do, I don't know if they told you, but it's included in the cost of your course. Vanderbilt's going to fly you all to Ireland. They didn't tell you that? There's going to be some unused airplanes at the end of this election that we're going to be able to use. We're going to write Yeats on them and then travel. Well, people are trying to pay the debts for the time they're wasting with all of us. So this is called Cool Park in Ballylee. So, and again, you'll have this incredible relationship between the self and the world that he's trying to explore. In this case, I love this one, because it situates him more in nature, which, as I said, is something that I find particularly meaningful. So, Cool Park in Ballylee. Under my window ledge, the waters race, otters below and moor hens on the top, run for a mile undimmed in heaven's face, then darkening through dark raftery cellar drop, run underground, rise in a rocky place, in cool demesne, and there to finish up, spread to a lake and drop into a hole. What's water but the generated soul? Upon the border of that lake is a wood, now all dry sticks under a wintry sun, and in a copse of beeches there I stood, for nature's pulled her tragic buskin on, and all the ransom mirror of my mood. At sudden thunder of the mounting swan, I turned about and looked where branches break the glittering reaches of the flooded lake. Another emblem there. That's stormy white, but seems a concentration of the sky. And like the soul, it sails into the sight. And in the morning's gone, no man knows why, and is so lovely that it sets to right what knowledge or its lack had set awry, so arrogantly pure a child might think it can be murdered with a spot of ink. Sound of a stick upon the floor, a sound from somebody that toils from chair to chair, beloved books that famous hands have bound, old marble heads, old pictures everywhere, great rooms where traveled men and children found content or joy, a last inheritor where none is reigned, then that lack a name, and fame, where out of folly into folly came. A spot whereon the founders lived and died seemed once more dear than life. Ancestral trees, or gardens rich in memory glorified, marriages, alliances, and families, and every bride's ambition satisfied. Where fashion or mere fantasy decrees, we shift about. All that great glory spent, like some poor Arab tribesman and his tent. We were the last romantics. Chose for theme traditional sanctity and loveliness. Whatever is written in what poets name the book of the people. Whatever most can bless the mind of a man or elevate a rhyme. But all has changed. That high horse riderless, though mounted in that saddle, Homer rode where the swan drifts upon a darkening flood. Those of you who have read the Romantics know that, in particular, this is an area that's so fun to look at, Byron connected the poetic task to the scientific theory that was called catastrophism. Catastrophism, if you've not heard of it, there's Neptunism and volcanism, suggests that the world has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. And that, and you see this in, for example, Don Juan, this image that the world had been previously great and then destroyed, is resurrected not quite as great, and then is destroyed, and then is resurrected not quite as great, and is destroyed, and so forth. And the evidence for this is that, you know from reading biblical texts, people used to live 800 or 900 years. So that was clearly, plus they would talk to God, which is advantageous, directly. And also you know that all the creatures from the past were bigger. Right? You'd find what looks like a tree trunk on the ground and it turns out to be a leg. And you think, wow, you know, I thought that we were the great and dominant species, but no, clearly something was here. And this was we see this in Buffon, for example. Buffon's work, the great historian a natural historian in Paris. You think, wow, you're in Paris, like it's the greatest civilization that ever was, and then you find a leg that's the size of a building, and you're like, well, okay. I guess we're a shadow of what was once here, a sense of a cyclical destruction. And it's interesting to read stories, for example, of the flood in this regard, because the flood is just yet another example, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, yet another example of the world being destroyed. It just happens all the time, either by fire or by flood. So his conception is a kind of natural one. This is evolution, and we're evolving downwards. In Yeats's world, it's not nature that's doing it. There's a sense and that's why I wanted to focus in this course on the modern world. There's something wrong with the modern world in his world, and rather than looking back and saying this as a kind of natural evolution in time, instead he's saying what can help buttress us against the impending chaos of this modern world. And so much of this poetry makes reference to this. So you get this conception as we see with the Romantics, of degeneration, but of quite a different sort, it seems to me. Another example of this, if you follow my travel agency, it's called the Poetic Travel Agency, and you go to Mont Blanc, and it's an amazing moment, and we're going to do this when we go there in a couple of weeks. You sit at the base of Mont Blanc and you read Mont Blanc, the poem by Shelley. And he looks up at first of all, he doesn't look up at the mountain. It's one of the great things that you realize when you're there, is that all of your misconceptions are wrong. Half the poem almost is about the river. So he stands and he looks down at the river Arve, and he says, where the hell does all this water come from? And how come it's rushing so quickly? And then it's almost like he's looking more closely and he realizes that if you look down the banks of the Alve, there's all these broken trees and all these smashed rocks. And he's like, wow. So I wonder where this force comes from. Look at all this destruction in this river. And then at some point, he looks up and he looks at the mountain, Mont Blanc. And he goes, oh my, this is so beautiful. And then he looks more carefully and realizes that the source of all this destruction is the melting glaciers that are coming down from the mountain. So what he's looking at is it's not the sublime, unimaginably beautiful heights of Mont Blanc. Of course, there's that. But there's also just the fact that you're staring at destruction. And if you read that alongside of, for example, Frankenstein, which was written in the same period, and in fact, he went hiking with Mary up to the Mer de Glace. They see what they saw. Of course, global warming has destroyed it, but there was this Mer de Glace that was all glacier, and he imagined the whole thing just coming down on top of civilization and destroying it. So he thought that the whole valley of Chamonix all the way down was going to be destroyed by this thing that was coming at them, which is this glacier. And the glacier is such a great image of like undifferentiated, perilous, freezing cold, not hospitable for life, and so forth and so on. That's the vision of Shelley and Mary Shelley and Byron, different versions of it. Here, again, by contrast, yeah, they are, he is making reference to a kind of romantic world, but in quite different ways, because it seems to me that for Yeats, the fear is man-made destruction. It's mankind that's menacing here. Yeah, there's the roof-leveling wind, that's true. But I think it's more an image of the chaos that is the modern world. So it's one of the ways. So I guess my argument would be that the modern writers like Yeats pick up on themes that we're very familiar with from the Romantic period, but the modern period is distinctly more terrifying, partly because God is dead, so there's obviously no eternal meaning, and partly because it's mankind that's doing the destroying, which is a little bit more frightening, I think, somehow. So what do? You count on family, you buy a damn tower, right? You invoke that the bees come and build a nest in the stair. You stitch poetry. You keep the fire burning. You bring the children to some level of enlightenment. You hope, and if not, if they don't uphold what you believe, then you ask them to manacle. Then you ask that their souls be manacled to the Red Sea. There's a good bleak image for you. So that's how the world works. Are there questions about this world? It's manifestly true on the one hand, and it's manifestly frightening on the other. But yeah.
But Yeats lived in an incredibly chaotic country.
Yes. At an incredibly chaotic time. And by linking himself to Parnell, also links himself to revolution, but with the awareness, and himself Protestant, and aware of what the Protestants had done in this country, and so yeah, it is and we are looking at if you want to look at the politics of Yeats, there's so much, but a poem like 1919 or Easter 1916. Which is, it's a whole other course to think about his politics, and it's enormously complicated in the same way that thinking about Joyce's politics is an enormously complicated task. But it would tell you, yeah, just that Ireland is a microcosm of incredible political struggle at the time, and then remained so for so long. It's so shocking. I'm sure that a lot of you have been to Northern Ireland to see how tall those walls are. In fights between people who are more similar than they are different. They have walls that are like 90 feet high to protect them, the Protestants from the Catholics, like, and vice versa. It's unimaginable. So anyhow, if you do go to Belfast and you take one of the black taxis and you go around, you realize just what kind of a time was coming. It's mind-boggling. So, yeah.
This is just a logistic way. He renovated the house.
Yep,
For his wife.
He did.
For his children grown then.
well, his children are born. Well, I think a lot of this is fantasy. You know, how much time he actually spent in the tower, I don't think was enormous. But he did renovate, and he never renovated the top of the tower. It's never been completely fixed. But he did renovate the house. And, you know, I think that a lot of his task is to create a past for himself, which, like the rest of us, we just make shit up. That glorifies us. That makes good sense. It works. Well, sometimes. That's why they invented divorce for when it fails.
Did Yeats have a tradition of reciting poetry as he was recorded? And it sounded like he was a bit older during the BBC recording
Yeah.
at the beginning. But was it his tradition to recite at gatherings or talks?
That's a great question. It's absolutely in the tradition to have been reciting regularly. How often? I'm not entirely sure. I can vaguely guess just because I feel like I worked with his reincarnation. He would do it quite regularly. And when Grossman would read, he would come in and he was very respectful and calm and perfectly attired and so forth. And by the end of it, his hair was like this and his jacket was half off and his he had broken all the windows in the building and so forth. So I don't know if Yeats was, you hear, Yeats is more sing-songy than dramatic, I think. But yeah, the poetic tradition is all about the oral tradition. It's why, one of the greatest pleasures, there are a million pleasures in doing this course, and I love doing this, and I look forward to it all year. One of the great pleasures in life is to read poetry. It's something that, and it always feels right to be reading it publicly. I don't know if you sit in your house and you read poetry aloud to yourself, which is great, but there's something amazing to read it together. It feels right. So, yeah.
How did Yeats stands politically, especially after the 1916 Easter Revolution of a year ago, 100 years ago?
Yeah.
Did he approve of that?
Well, Yeats, Yeats is not, and again, I started the course by saying this is the era of Marinetti. Right? What is it? 1912, the Futurist Manifesto. 1914, the First World War. 1916, Cabaret Voltaire, and the rise of Dada in resistance to the war. 1917, the Russian Revolution. Holy mackerel. He does not advocate violence the way that we see in the early Marinetti and the Futurist Manifesto. He does not necessarily advocate peace, like just complete peace, because he also does imagine the need to erect an independent, free Irish state, which means struggle. And a lot of what he does politically is, I think, reflected in the poetry, which is he's looking for solid rock foundation for something that will endure into the future, against age, against the fact that your lover derides you, against. So I guess the answer means that you've got to go both into the politics of the day, which he writes a lot about, and link it to the task here. In that regard, he's not unlike Joyce, it seems to me. There seems to be a connection here. So, and as I've said since the beginning, his is a complicated politic. Given my own politics, it's weird to be thinking about Yeats. But at the same time, not. From a literary perspective, not really. But he links himself to some version, in certain things that he says, he links himself to some version of nationalism and fascism that I totally abhor. But he never dwells on it the way that Ezra Pound does, for example. is enormously complicated. And sometimes I do think that he's shopping for images in everything, including politics. So,
We have to make that the last question. So thank you
Thank you
very
so
much.
much.
Big hand for Professor Barsky.